This week on Dig Me Out.
Well,
yes,
next
they're
track.
They're way more informed than we are. Tim.
That's basically what he's saying, yes. We don't pay attention.
That's not a secret.
Tim and Jay review Psalm 69 by Ministry.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me for episode 163 of Season 4, my trusty sidekick, Mr. Jason Ziak. Tonto?
Say trusty sidekick.
I don't know.
I guess so.
Try to change it up every week.
I'll take that, I guess.
Okay, cool.
I don't want to be fully responsible for this mess.
Jay, you know, the last season and then in the beginning of the season, we've had a number of people generous with us and have sent us a few dollars and have picked out albums for us to review. And a lot of them are bands that we were completely unfamiliar with. This week, we're going with a band that I think you and I are somewhat familiar with, and that band is Ministry, correct?
Yes.
As we like to do from time to time, it's good to get the person who suggested the album on the line with us because we want to know the reasoning behind their picks. We had people in the past pick things because they thought this is a really interesting album that didn't get enough publicity and it deserves some more attention. And then people pick albums because this is their favorite band and they want to hear what we have to say about it for some reason. And
some people pick albums just to torture us.
Some people pick albums just to torture us and hear us contort our opinions in ways that did not be completely negative. But in this case, we're going to go with one of the bands that I think is probably one of the more definitive bands of the 90s, and that's Ministry, and their probably most definitive album, which is Psalm 69. And to help us check this album out, get into the band, is joining us from Reading in the UK. Welcome, everybody, Mr. Matthew Sleightholme, or is it just Matt? Is Matt fine?
Matt's fine, yep.
All right,
yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, Ministry. This is your third pick overall. I think you gave us the Symposium album last year. Is that right?
That's right, yep.
And then we just did Carter, the Unstoppable Sex Machine. That was our last week's episode. And we're going off in a different direction with Ministry. This is, I guess you'd say, one of the most well-known industrial bands, if not the most well-known industrial band of the 90s. Is that fair to say, guys?
Well, I think Nine Inch Nails was pretty well known, but
we'll get into that because I'm gonna make the argument that Nine Inch Nails is not an industrial band, but
okay, everybody, stay tuned for that one.
Stay tuned for that. But I wanted to ask Matt, how did you discover Ministry? Was it in the 80s with their earlier synth pop sounds, or was it in the 90s with albums like this?
No, it was definitely the 90s. So it would have probably been around a friend's house who had things like The Land of Rape and Honey and The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. And then this album, as you kind of say, was more of their breakthrough album and a bit more, I guess, available to most audiences.
And were you into like industrial as a whole, or did you just sort of focus in on this band? I'm thinking of bands, there are other bands like Killing Joke, and Skinny Puppy. Yeah, those sorts of bands. Where did you, after discovering Ministry, or were you already familiar with those bands and then discovered Ministry? How did that work?
No, probably Ministry was the first of that type, and then so Ministry, Nine Inch Nails, kind of early Marilyn Manson as well, I guess. And then from there, I guess Ministry is one of those bands that got me into heavier parts of music. So from there, I'd go into things like Sepultura and Nailbomb and stuff like that, Fudge Tunnel. But you'll kind of see with my other two picks, I'm probably more lighter rock and things like that normally. So, Therapy I'd probably say is my favourite band, but you've already done them anyway. Things like the God Machine and stuff like that as well.
Oh yes, God Machine from the first season. That was an interesting one. And we did Therapy last year. Very cool band. Jay and I both enjoyed them. Was it last year or was it 2 years ago? I can't remember.
I think it was 2 years ago, I think.
Oh, wow. I think you're right. Yeah.
It was a while ago.
It was 2 seasons ago. Wow. It's all bleeding together now. So you mentioned about Nine Inch Nails. So just as a quick aside, I was thinking about the industrial genre. And I think Nine Inch Nails sort of transcends industrial. I think they have industrial elements, But like, if you listen to, I think once you get into the Downward Spiral or post Downward Spiral, they turn into really more of an alternative band. And in some aspects, Downward Spiral is an alternative album more so than just an industrial album. They just have certain songs which have industrial sounds, but like, you can't take a song like Hurt and tell me that's an industrial song. I mean, that's closer to more alternative music from the 90s than any industrial bands. And then going after that, the last couple of releases, whether it's the one that just came out or with Teeth or Year Zero, I mean, again, I think those albums sound way more just like alternative music with, heavy drum loops and whatnot, rather than comparing it to like this, comparing it to Ministry, and songs like TV2 or,
Yeah. Well, I think Nine Inch Nails can write. He can write pretty music, right? And that's the difference between what he's capable of and just industrial music, which is, not the intent of industrial music is not to be pretty or beautiful or, you know what I mean?
Right.
The aesthetic is the complete opposite. So he's capable of that. I think he stayed remarkably true to the ingredients that he uses to make his music. He's just able to diversify in terms of the types of songs he writes. So I guess you could split hairs over, his industrial, just the approach, like the production approach and the instrumentation, or is it that combined with, an aesthetic and attitude? I would say it's probably both. And so I guess the songwriting aspect, I think you're right in terms of, he's diverged quite a bit to be able to do things that are, either more accessible or not just, angry or ugly or, that kind of thing.
I'd agree with Jay, because I think it's gone more electronic dancey in the last few albums.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously he's done things through soundtrack stuff with The Social Network, and I think he's got another soundtrack coming up as well. But I don't think you could use Hurt as the sole definition of why he has to be alternative, because then you're basically saying no industrial band could ever do a ballad. I think there's a lot of background and compression in the vocals behind Hurt as well, and then the kind of subject matter of what it is.
Well, it's almost an emo song when you get into the lyrics. But this is not a show about Nine Inch Nails. We should talk about Ministry, and specifically, we should probably touch on some history of the band.
History of the band.
So Ministry has a huge history, so I'm not going to actually cover everything. I'm just going to sort of gloss over, and then we'll get to some stuff afterwards. Ministry formed in 1981 by Al Jourgenson in Chicago, Illinois. Originally, they were just a new wave synth pop band, and they started to incorporate heavier riffs in the late 80s. The album we're reviewing, Psalm 69, ended up being their most successful album. It was released in 1992. They ended up touring Lollapalooza and selling over 1 million copies of Psalm 69. Now, I want to put that in perspective. So for the life of this album, it sold 1 million copies. Pearl Jam's Verses sold 900,000 copies the first week it was out. So when we talk about, if a band's too big for us to review because we're supposed to be digging out more obscure stuff, I would not say that Ministry is necessarily, in terms of mainstream approval and success, on the same level of a Pearl Jam, even though they got played quite a bit on MTV and they sold 1 million records and blah, blah, blah. Because 1 million records in the 90s is not the same as 1 million records today in terms of album sales. And even though this album charted at number 27 and N.W.O made it to number 11 as an alt-rock single, the follow-up album actually charted higher. Filth Pig charted at number 19 as an album in the United States, but it only sold 236,000 copies. So it was basically like the first week it was out, it charted really high and then immediately dropped off. And probably because it's not as good a record as this record. So people did not end up buying it as much. So over the course of 1981 to 2013, the band released 13 albums. There's been a lot of different members of this band. I'm not going to go through it all. But in 2008, after 27 years, Jourgenson decided that he was going to end the band. But of course, with all rock bands, he decided in 2011 to reunite the band, as a lot of 90s bands did in the late 2000s. They played the Wacken Open Air Festival in 2012, and then they released a new album in 2012 called Relapse, followed by a World Tour. And in 2013, they released the album From Beer to Eternity, following the death of longtime guitarist, I'm going to screw up his last name. Matthew, do you know how to say it? Mike Sakia?
No. Yeah.
Okay. So, interesting story behind. He played with some other bands, including Revolting Cocks and Rigor Mortis. And on December 23rd, 2012, at the Rail Club in Fort Worth, Texas, he was performing as a part of the 50th birthday for Bruce Corbett, who's the singer for Rigor Mortis. He collapsed on stage and died that Sunday morning at a local hospital. Initial reports thought it was a seizure, but it was a heart attack brought on by heart disease, and he was 47 years old. So that pretty much ended Ministry at that point. Jourgenson decided he did not want to go on as a touring entity. So that is the sort of condensed history of Ministry. Again, I only really covered the primary stuff, which is Psalm 69, which actually has a subtitle, which is The Way to Succeed and the Way to Suck Eggs, which is a quote from Aleister Crowley. There's also then a second title to the album, which I cannot pronounce, but is a Greek word meaning head, because the way to succeed and the way to suck eggs is a play on words involving a sexual position known as 69. You can figure that out on your own out there.
All right, so why on Spotify is it KE
Yeah,
asterisk A asterisk H asterisk asterisk?
because that is the Greek word for head.
Okay. Makes it really difficult to find this record if you're trying to find it.
I know.
They were not marketing geniuses.
No, I don't think they were going for that. Matt, anything to add to that history?
No, I think it might have been the first album that Mike was on, actually, Mikey.
Yes.
So I think that's probably pretty relevant. And it sounds like I've just read Al Jourgenson's biography. It sounds like he and Mike were pretty close all the way through it. There's clear divisions in kind of Al's view of the band and from what you get from some of the documentaries like Fix and Paul Barker's view of the band. So I think there's some interesting backstory there that we'll probably never find out.
And of course, like Matt, if you want to suggest an album for us to review, head on over to digmeoutpodcast.com to our request or review page. So we got some Facebook feedback on this record. Brandon Trammell said, excellent choice. Ministry was one of those bands that seemed to bring together all kinds of folks, metalheads, skaters, goths, punks. They all dug this band. It's hard to say if this is their best record. The Mind is a Terrible Taste. Terrible Thing to Taste is also a complete killer, but Psalm 69 is no slouch. Industrial really isn't my thing, but those riffs tug at my teenage heartstrings and remind me of playing along on a busted ass Squire in my bedroom. That's cool. Scott Russell Helgram, a couple of comments. Oh my God, you guys have to go back and listen to With Sympathy just once. Oh my God. And then Ministry generally hasn't aged well for me, but this was and is my favorite of theirs, and I still like it a ton. Tim James, I thought you guys reviewed overlooked albums. This was pretty big, I thought. Maybe not embraced by the mainstream radio, but the videos made for it were on Headbangers Ball a lot. That's true. They were on Headbangers Ball, but I consider those specialty shows to be a little bit outside of the mainstream. That's why they're on the specialty shows. Same thing with like 120 Minutes. You know, a lot of bands never made it off of 120 Minutes into mainstream rotation. So I consider that, you know, sort of fair territory for us to explore. Gavin Reed, Jesus Built My Hot Rod is probably my favorite song of the 90s. Blew my mind, then still does today. Far and away their best and most consistent album, but still tough to get through in one sitting. Interesting. And then, it's Matt. Still one of my favorite Ministry albums. A band that created and owned their own genre. We have a lot to thank them for. What did you mean by that, Matt? What do we have to thank them for?
So I think you see a lot of influence. I think Fear Factory and Demanufacture, that album, there's a lot of similar kind of sounds, that kind of industrial, as if you're in a factory type noise, the kind of echo and like a big space type sound of things, and the way riffs kind of changed. And I think you saw that a lot with things like Nail Bomb as well. It's that collaboration that the guys from Sepultura and Fudge Tunnel did. I think if you think back to what we were just saying about Nine Inch Nails and the way he kind of changed to more electronica, I know that Trent was with Al for some of this album around that time frame as well. So I'm sure there's some influencing there. But with the way Ministry and Nine Inch Nails have both opened up and kind of changed throughout their careers and adapted their sounds or what they wanted to do, then I think it's probably opened up a lot of things like some kind of the electro kind of sound of Crystal Castles or Enter Shikari, that kind of stuff, kind of made that more tolerable or more available to people that you wouldn't have had if there wasn't that kind of crossover audience.
Well, that's a good segue for us to actually get into the record itself. It's a short one. It's only 9 songs. One of the shorter albums of the 90s we've ever reviewed. More of a, in terms of length, we talk about the 70s albums that were like 6 or 7 songs long. But it's also still 45 minutes. There's quite a bit of tracks that are, there's one song that's 3 minutes. Everything else is 4 and over. Or 2 songs are 3 minutes. But let's go into track 1, N.W.O. Because it's the lead track. I think it's the key track for me on the entire record. It sort of sets the stage for everything that you need to know about this record. That pounding machine metal riff that starts that song. In terms of calling it industrial and in terms of metal and stuff like that, I don't know that there's a better band in terms of like replicating the actual sound of like machinery as a percussion instrument than Ministry. They do such a good job, and the thing that I was amazed with, especially when I put on headphones and listen to this, is I don't feel like the sound quality has deteriorated in terms of, I feel like electronic instruments, you can hear their age a lot when you're going back and listening to records that it feature like electronic drums or keyboards or stuff like that. You can sort of hear like, oh, that's an outdated keyboard part or an outdated drum loop.
You can hear the limitations of the technology of the time.
Exactly. And to me, this sounds a lot more, even though I know it's not, it sounds a lot more organic. What did you guys think going back and listening to the record starting out?
I'll just throw in, I think, building off of Matt's observation of how influential this was. I definitely, I thought of it, in my mind that way, and it was just reaffirmed as I re-listened to it. The way that I think of this record, I do remember it bringing a lot of people together. So, in high school, I was sort of a jock, but I was also an art student. So I had a good mix of friends. And I was also, trying to play in bands and stuff. So I sort of had a unique position to be friends with a lot of different people. And this was definitely one of those bands that kind of crossed lines in a weird way. Mm-hmm. And that's how I became aware of Ministry and Nine Inch Nails and industrial music. So to me, sort of hearing this music through my friends, when I heard this record, and specifically a song like N.W.O, the thing that was different for me was suddenly they started to sound like a rock band. I think prior to this, they may have some guitars mixed in the album before this, but it was still very much in a more electronic, pure electronic sort of aesthetic and format. But I think on this record, they start to take a turn, especially with how big a role the guitars play in this, but also just in how the sort of the programming for the sequences and stuff and the drum machines is done. So, for example, on N.W.O, there's this double bass, kick drum blast at the beginning of the song, throughout the intro. That comes out of metal music, and that's something that when you mix it up with the guitar, it sounds like it could almost be like a Metallica riff. But
right.
Obviously, it goes in a bunch of different other places that are more, I think, akin to industrial music with the amount of sampling going on and, bringing George Bush quotes in and just various different, little effects and stuff. And the super compressed vocal, really gravelly and kind of distant. So, my impression of this band at this time is kind of summed up in this song in a lot of ways. It's taking that industrial background and merging it with sort of a rock rock or metal aesthetic.
Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably the first album where Al's vocals are a lot clearer, even though they're more distorted. So you can actually kind of hear it a lot more clearly. I think the drive through that percussive kind of rhythm is pretty heavy and kind of sets up the album. And you really start to notice things like the loop, where it's a loop without it getting annoying, like an irritating song in your head. It's just that driving force of that loop and that coming round and that riff crashing through. I think really.
Well, I think one of the things that he's able to do with the loops is that what Jay was mentioning with like having a Metallica double bass sound is like, if you weren't paying attention, you'd almost think that might be just a really kick-ass drummer. Like, even though you know in your head like it's too perfect and it's too on the everything's moving in a machine-like way. But I think for the most part, this song and then moving into the second song, Just One Fix, he does a good job of making the drums, even though they're a looped drum part, sound like an actual drummer, but just like a robot doing the drumming. Like it's just perfect. Whereas sometimes when you hear industrial or any music that utilizes a sequenced drum beat, you're like, well, yeah, there's no way the drummer's playing all those things or you have to have two drummers. It's like the friggin' Allman Brothers or something. You have two drummers back there. That was one thing that I appreciated, is that even though this is quote unquote industrial, like you said, this has a very strong foothold in metal music, and especially like the thrash of Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth and those bands. That I don't think that some of the other bands, which I find interesting because, well, for one, those bands didn't have mainstream breakthroughs necessarily. I guess Metallica did in the 90s with the Black Album, but they actually toned down their metal side and became more of a groove rock band in a lot of ways. They slowed the tempo down. They focused on the bass, the riffs with like songs like Enter Sandman and some of those stuff off of Load and whatever. Whereas Ministry went in the opposite direction. They got those earlier, Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All influences and combine them with their industrial sounds. What's funny is that when I think of industrial, I think of there being some sort of keyboard aspect to it, just because you think of industrial, you think synthesizers and stuff like that. But I really had a hard time picking out a lot of that stuff going on in most of the songs. It was really guitar driven, which I guess being a kid that didn't grow up listening necessarily to a lot of industrial music and sort of listening to it in reverse, going back to a lot of this stuff, my head was always around the fact that it was like evil keyboards, not evil guitars, that I was scared to listen to when I was 15 years old. So I was like, oh, that's the music that kids who wear like black leather jackets listen to and have patches and stuff like that.
Well, that's my point about, I think the albums, Matt would know better, but I think the albums prior to this, it is more about keyboards. I mean, the guitars like slowly work their way in, I think album over album, but when you get to this one, it's like, okay, now maybe it's the relationship that he made with this guitarist, but they definitely become a huge part of what they're building the songs around, as opposed to building them around a synth or building them around a drum machine. might be a good segue to move into the next song. But my biggest comment about Just One Fix is that guitar riff is enormous, and when I revisited it now, I might be wrong here, but this is Rammstein. Like, this is a band that like took this song and turned it into an entire career, because I mean the riff almost sounds like Du Hast, and which was their big breakout song, and just the whole approach. I mean, it's as if the band, that band heard this song and said, well, shit, let's just make a whole band around this song and just keep writing songs like this. I don't know. I might be completely wrong, but they formed a couple years after this album came out, and boy, does it sound similar.
Matt, thoughts on Just One Fix?
Yeah, I think it's all about the riff, isn't it? I think that riff and that repetition, and I think it's the layers of the samples as well. With this album, the key difference for me with this album with the earlier ones is not just how big the guitars are now, but it's also the layers of sound with the different samples and different loops that are being brought in. So the earlier albums are definitely more metal, I'd say. Sorry, not more metal, more electronic. And this it's got that breadth now. And I think getting a play to drugs in a song is always good for your album sales as well.
Yeah, one note I had on this was, quote unquote, I guess this is what heroin withdrawal feels like. In terms of the song, I think that's what they're trying to get at. Am I right there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the biography, him and Mikey were definitely well into their speedballs and doing all they could do to get the drugs they wanted. And then the other half of the band weren't interested, so they said that Al and Mike recorded overnight and redid half the work that the other guys did during the day. So how true any of that is, I don't know, because obviously it's Al's book. But yeah, it definitely sounds like there was quite a dichotomy in the band.
How much of a band were they at this point? Because I basically think of them as Al. Like, I don't really think of them as a band. I think of it as a one-man kind of thing that revolves people in and out. I mean, how much of a band were they at this point?
I'd agree with you. And in fact, looking at, I looked at the liner notes, and they've got a picture of, I think they only credit Al and Paul Barker as being Ministry, and then it says additional personnel with some of the other people. So even at that point, Mikey isn't considered part of the band. And in fact, Mikey goes in and out of Ministry throughout the later albums as well.
Well, I mentioned the sort of the thrash influence that or built upon it, what Jay mentioned. Track 3, TV2, that to me is where you get, like, I guess the most thrash. It has, that could be a Suicidal Tendencies song in some aspects. It's got this speed metal sort of riff and beat to it. This is not necessarily what I would consider like the area I want Ministry to go. I sort of like when they're in that like chugging, up to mid to up tempo kind of feel, because I can kind of just like, get into it. Almost becomes a hypnotic trance on songs like Just One Fix or N.W.O. But when they get into like this, like 200 beats per minute or something like that, it's gonna be ridiculous. I just feel like it's like somebody pushed the button on the tempo key on the keyboard.
It sounds like you're fast forwarding an old cassette.
Yeah, it does sound like it. Yeah, this is one of the songs I did not necessarily feel like it held up well, because it betrays the industrial, the sort of the sound of the industrial, looped drums more so than any of the other songs, where I'm just like, yeah, that sounds like a machine.
Well, yeah, I think this song is, listening to it now is genuinely comical to me. I mean, it's funny. I was actually laughing, not only from just the aspect of like how fast the drum machine's playing, but when he gets to those breaks and he does that super fast vocal and he yells, "Connect the goddamn dots." I just started laughing. I don't know. There was just something like ridiculous about how over the top it was. The one thing I will note about it, though, besides that, is that it kind of has a surf guitar feel to it in a weird way. And I guess, I don't know, maybe there's not that much space between the guitar approach on surf guitar and speed metal in terms of, what's going on there in terms of the playing. It's just a more extreme version of that. But it's like there's some aspect of it when you speed it up that fast and, you can only play, basically, I think you're probably only playing one string on the guitar. Like if you're playing that fast, it's hard to play chords.
Right.
It kind of almost has a weird kind of surf guitar feel to it, which I think in with this song, and then when we talk later with Jesus Built My Hot Rod, there's some kind of like the recognition potentially here of like early rock and roll on this record that obviously I don't think this band had ever, really explored or touched on before. So I think from that aspect that the song is significant to me on the record. What do you think, Matt?
Interesting.
Yeah, I think this one, and there's another kind of more instrumental one that is, the two songs that kind of grate on me a little if I listen back to the album now. And I think it is just because they stick out compared to the rest of the album. I can't remember what the other one is actually. We'll probably work it out when we get there. To go to what you're saying about the surf metal thing, I think there's something about this album that has the ability to be both heavy and light at the same time. And I think you hear that through a couple of the songs, and I think there's quite a lot of humor in the album as well. So I think that comes across with a lot of the songs.
Well, in terms of throwback sounds, track 4, Hero, to me that sounds like it has some like new wave of British heavy metal feel to it in terms of the beat. Has like that Judas Priest, Maiden kind of thing going on.
That riff could be an early Maiden.
Yeah.
Riff or Judas Priest riff of that era, for sure.
Right. Which again is, this is, in retrospect, you're able to pick out some of these influences a little bit more. It's a bit more of a diverse record musically than maybe it appeared at first glance or on first listen. With you mentioning the sort of Dick Dale surf guitar kind of thing going on, and then this with like a Priest or Maiden metal riff. I'm curious about what you guys think about I guess, Jay, you mentioned about the sort of comical lyrical delivery in TV2, and Matt, you mentioned at the top how his vocals are a bit more clear on this record. I'll admit I had a really hard time understanding anything he was saying lyrically. I ended up having to like look things up because his vocals are so distorted. Not actually owning the record, Matt, does he print the lyrics in the album liner notes?
No.
So when this record came out, you basically had no way of telling what the lyrics were because it's not like there was a database of lyrics like there are now all over the web. You can just type in lyrics for Ministry's N.W.O. and you get 15 different sites that have what the lyrics are for that. In 1992, it just didn't exist. So I'm curious, like, are you able to discern what he's singing just based on listening?
I probably can now, but I've got pretty much every Ministry album, so I'm used to it. So,
Gotcha.
I can't remember if I could originally. I would guess probably not. So there's probably key lines I would pick out of songs, and I probably know really well. I probably couldn't tell you whole verses if I thought about it.
And this music's written for like, I don't know. I felt like it was the time I discovered it, probably the same time in your life, Matt. You're in your, sometime somewhere between maybe 12 and 18, and raging hormones, and it just the energy of it and just the rebellious nature of it. It lyrically, like there's parts of it that'll stand out and you'll be like, yeah, I get what he's saying, man. F the system. And then there's other parts where it doesn't matter. It's just all about the, just the aggression and the energy. So I think the record kind of, and for the most part, their music kind of does that, where you're like, you get enough of the context of like, hey, he's talking about something important. That's cool. And then there's a bunch of, lines where it's just like, just screaming, which is kind of, how just a lot of 13-year-old boys feel.
Well, I only bring it up because, this is 1992. This is just after the Gulf War, and there's clearly a influence of the Bush 1 presidency and the Gulf War. And this song is called Hero. It's referencing G.I. Joe and killing machines, and it's a very relevant record for the time in a way that a lot of bands were a bit more general in their, I guess, social and political critiques. They weren't necessarily as blunt and as, New World Order is a George Bush phrase.
I think there was a lot of, I don't know, my memory at the time was that there was a lot of metal and punk and industrial music that was very, very, very political. I think even more so then than it is now. I mean, I think it's it's almost impossible to find a metal record right now that has any political context other than occasionally Megadeth will say something. But like, I feel like at the time there was a ton. I mean, the Megadeth records at the time, this stuff, I don't know. I felt like there was a lot of it. Nuclear Assault, there was a bunch of bands that were like talking about sort of late 80s politics and this kind of subject matter. I think it's actually, it didn't strike me strange at the time at all. I think the question is, listening to it now, for me at least, is it still relevant? You know what I mean? Talking about sort of politics of that time, is it still relevant now, listening back to it?
And it's interesting, it's a theme that's stuck through later Ministry albums as well. So he, you said Bush 1, but he also spent a lot of time railing against Bush 2 as well. I know he's done a lot for trying to get people to register for voting and things like that. So he's one of the few people that I kind of know for that period of time that stayed with having a strong view on politics and wanting to have an impact. And I think, like Jay's saying, I can't think of many bands that do it now. You saying Megadeth made me think, Countdown to Extinction, Rust in Peace, all those kind of end of the Cold War, What else do we have to worry about now? That kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, there was a whole like time of that, and then it's kind of interesting. I don't know, just a side subject. I feel like now, when there's plenty of political things to talk about, there's very little bands that do it. It's sort of like they'll get lost in like mythology or, drug stuff or some other subject matter rather than dabble in, current politics.
Well, not to use this as an excuse to mention, one of the bands we always talk about, but I recently read an interview with Nicky Wire from Manic Street Preachers, and he was saying how appalled he was that the lead singer of Mumford and Sons basically said that they don't want to talk about controversial things because it would hurt their audience. Like they're more comfortable just sort of writing sugary love songs with heartache and stuff like that because hey, we don't want to offend anybody. And he was like, you don't want to offend anybody? Like, why are you playing music? Like, he's like, that's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. He said it in a much more eloquent and Nicky Wire kind of way.
Yeah.
But it made me think about a band like the Manic Street Preachers who have written, and Matt, you could probably sort of speak more to this. They can play stadiums over in the UK. They play the big festivals and stuff like that, and yet they have written some incredibly political lyrics up until the new record too. I mean, there are political lyrics on the new record. It doesn't seem like that translates well to an American audience, other than some subgenres of like metal and stuff like that. On a mainstream scale, I don't think political bands have ever made it in the United States. Rage Against the Machine probably the only ones, and they had pretty much abandoned that by, they made social commentary songs, but they were never they never attacked the president by name. You know what I mean? It was more about racism in general or economic inequality in general. It was never about naming names.
Well, now when it's such a hot topic here, and that band doesn't exist anymore. They're pulled out of mothballs in some context. Either individually or as a band every now and then to sort of make an appearance. But it's like when there's actually, I felt like in the 90s and at this time period, compared to now, there was way less the stuff that was going on really. I mean, at the time it seemed really important, but now in the context of things, it was kind of compared to now, it just seems, I don't know, so minor. I feel like there's so much more now to be writing about. And, if there was a young Ministry or a young Rage Against the Machine, I don't know, it seems like there's way more subject matter, but to the point of to Nicky Wire about, the Mumford and Sons guys. And that's the opinion that most people in pop subscribe to. I don't want to alienate anybody. I need every fan I can get. And I don't want to ever say anything that's going to alienate anybody. So I'm just going to stay in the middle and just write love songs and make, U2 style lyrics that sort of seem deep, but actually don't mean anything.
Right. I'm curious, Matt, when a band like this is writing lyrics that are very specific to the United States, does that present any sort of a challenge in terms of getting into the music with regards to, it's I would imagine especially back in '92, it's not like you could pop on the web and be like, okay, well, what is he talking about with regards to this? I'm just like, sometimes when I listen to a band from UK or Australia and they're making cultural references, I'm like, I don't know what that means, and I have to end up going and like Googling the lyrics of somebody's, of some artist because I don't understand what's quite going on. Does that present challenges when you're listening to it?
Probably not as much, because I think our culture is so influenced by what's going on with you guys anyway. So, if I come back to the Megadeth song where, you've got the first George Bush saying "read my lips" and things like that, I kind of knew what all that was, but I can understand what you're saying in terms of the other way around.
Well,
yes,
next
they're
track...
they're way more informed than we are, Tim.
That's basically what he's saying, yes. We don't pay attention.
That's not a secret.
Right. Well, so the next track 5, Jesus Built My Hot Rod, is, I guess, the track that is most well known of all Ministry songs because of the amount of play that it got on Headbangers Ball, Alternative Nation, whatever the specialty shows on MTV. It was also, I believe, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe that was N.W.O. One of the songs was went up against... Oh, it was N.W.O. was nominated for Best Metal Performance at the Grammys in 1993. Lost to Nine Inch Nails. Yeah.
Which is funny. Like, if I going back to like maybe like 1989, 1990, if I would have told my friends that like this music at that time that those two bands would be nominated for Grammys in the metal category, they would have thought it was crazy.
Yeah.
Because they would have thought of metal as being, like hair metal. Or, there was obviously bands like Metallica, but they would have never,
right.
if I would, so they're going to be nominated against Metallica. They're like, what?
No way, man. Yeah, exactly. So I didn't know this the first time listening to this, but it's actually Gibby Hayes from the Butthole Surfers that's singing on this song. And the story goes...
Right. He's in the video.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah. I totally forgot about that.
The story goes that Gibby Hayes was so... out of his mind on whatever substances he was on in the studio that they basically recorded for a long period of time, and then Al took all the tape and like spliced it up and stuck it in where he could actually match up the performance with the song. But then it took him like 2 weeks to do that. So what you're hearing is a very like pieced together performance by Gibby Hayes. Which I only have one Gibby Haynes story, and that's that I was at a loft in some part of Manhattan for CMJ in 1996, and I saw him at this concert. It wasn't really a concert, it was just like a loft where there was like a band playing in a corner and lots of industry people walking around, and Gibby Haynes was there quite clearly utilizing a device to inhale some sort of smoke. And I don't know if that smoke was of the pot variety or of the crack variety, but he was definitely enjoying his... illegal substance at that particular party, which we left soon after.
Nice.
So that was my sighting of Gibby Haynes in that particular context. But back to the song, Jesus Built My Hot Rod. There's no question that besides politics, I'd say like religion is probably the second most important category of lyrical content for Al. This one having the more religious bent, and it's interesting that this song did well, because I wonder if a song like this now, where I'm sure we consider blasphemy to even mention Jesus in any sort of context that isn't fawning, would get him protests and would get him kicked off of MTV.
Yes. This song would be way more controversial now than it was then, and that is freaking nuts, because there's such a huge fundamental Christian movement here that again, same with politics. I remember at the time, I mean, even Ozzy Osbourne, and I mean, there were tons of artists writing like anti-religion, because there was also a lot of scandals with televangelists at the time, being exposed, for ripping people off, and there was a lot of different artists, writing material about that and talking about that. And it was a huge topic. And again, in a weird way, even though 20 years later, you think we'd progress, we've actually regressed. I think aspects of this record would be way more, especially if it was I think this stuff would be so underground now. They probably wouldn't hear much flack. But if you imagine, I mean, MTV was playing this video. It was out there and it was in this, sort of in the pop culture, atmosphere for a little while. But I totally forgot. I just wrapped my thoughts on the song. I totally forgot that it wasn't Al singing this, because one of my notes on it was, I thought he was pretending to have a Southern accent, which was funny through the vocal. The parts about it that I think are interesting besides that is that it definitely has a rockabilly feel. They reference Jerry Lee Lewis on it, which is a really interesting element to bring to metal and industrial music. And the other part about it is, you mentioned the keyboards not being, really in your face on this record. This riff is built on a keyboard sequence, which is really cool. So if you listen really closely, there's a synthesizer sort of pattern playing there that the guitar just plays on top of. So they're totally locked together, and it creates this really cool, like, thick riff that kind of bounces around and really propels the song. So I think those are the two things that really stood out to me as being kind of interesting about this now.
Yeah, and it's from reading the biography, Al basically says that they had this song ready. They had spent 750 grand on crack between him and Mikey, pretty much, and whatever other drugs, and they were getting pressure on the album then. And they handed this song over to the record company, who weren't very happy, but managed to get it out to college radio and things like that. And it then sold 1.5 million copies as a single, and that then allowed them to get another 750 grand for the rest of the album. So it worked out pretty well for them.
Wow. I remember at the time it was pretty, like, I don't know what I don't want to say revolutionary, but it was pretty remarkable. I remember the song being like not what anybody expected out of this band. It just kind of like hit, and you're like, wow, okay, this is different. I kind of wish, I'm not familiar with their material after this very much at all. I kind of wish there was more like this on the record, and I'm wondering if this is an area that they revisited it at all later in their career. Yeah.
Probably not really. The album's changed. Filth Pig was a lot slower, kind of felt a lot more depressing and heavier. Dark Side of the Spoon got pretty much panned by critics, but I actually think it's an alright album. But none of them, there's the kind of humor in the album titles and the song titles, but it seemed to ease off a bit and then only came back again with the last few albums. It's almost like the railing against George W. Bush brought back some of that spirit for him, and perhaps getting off a lot of the drugs as well.
I feel like looking at some of the later records, just looking at the titles, like they were struggling with almost being a parody of themselves. You know what I mean? Like, it's like almost too self-referential. You know what I mean? Like they were too aware of who they were and what their reputation was, and they were trying to, like, at least with the album titles, kind of playing off of that here and there. And then,
Yeah, and they did the same thing with the tour titles as well. So you've got the, See You Later and Sphincter and things like that. So
it's funny.
At least they have a sense of humor about it.
Yeah.
Some bands are a little too serious and take themselves a little too serious. But track 6, Scarecrow. This is where the band slows down. Some might use the word plotting. It's a bit of a dramatic shift from what we've heard on the previous 5 songs on the record.
It sounds like industrial Led Zeppelin.
That's one way
Listen to the drum beat. It's like doo 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 doo. It's just like it sounds like John Bonham. Somebody trying to play John Bonham on drum machine.
And to me, it sounds the way his vocal sounds on that song. Sounds like a precursor to Marilyn Manson. I don't know if you guys hear that to me or not, or hear the same thing that I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think in that point, I one of my notes was it could be almost any electronic industrial sort of band from the mid '90s. This song, like you could have told me you could have told me it was an early Marilyn Manson song. I would have believed you. You could tell me it was an album track from Nine Inch Nails. I probably would have believed you. Like it's a little bit anonymous sounding.
Yeah, and it definitely doesn't have the same intensity and recognition that the way that the earlier songs do on the record.
I think that's true. I think it's a song in search of an identity. It's almost the filler, isn't it? Really.
Yes, good word. It sounds like they were like found that John Bonham beat and then just played on it for 8 minutes.
Yeah, the 8 minutes is kind of brutal.
Yeah.
Yes. But then they get into Psalm 69, which, albeit having a really long sort of, intro with some nonsense going on for like a minute 20, something like that. When you actually get into the riff, it sounds a lot like some of the metal that's been going on for the last 5 to 10 years with like Mastodon and those kind of bands. I never thought of, I'm not saying that they listen to the song, let's go form a band. Just saying like, I never thought of Ministry being sort of an influence on some of those, I don't know what to call them, modern metal. What's a good term for them? Because they're not in the same vein of metal as say a Metallica or some of the thrash bands.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a term that's been coined for it yet, but it's kind of alternative metal almost, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure a term will merge here soon. I mean, I could also hear it being like, not that I listen to a ton of this band, but kind of a Slipknot-y kind of band sound too, in terms of the song, like with the big epic intro and then a metal riff. And I think also this song is very like, I like it. It's probably at the later end of the record, my favorite song on the second half of the record, other than Jesus Built My Heart, but it's kind of the formula for what they are, like big long intro. They use samples for the chorus instead of a vocal for the chorus a lot of the times. A metal riff. There's a break at 3 minutes where it kind of opens up again and goes back to the intro, and then it goes back to the riff. I just think that the type of the way the song is written and the elements that are in it almost are, you could lock this down as the template, at least for this era of the band, for how to write a song, and it would work pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think definitely the songs that are my favorites on earlier albums play to the same formula. So things like So What and probably Burning Inside and things like that. They're on earlier albums very similar, and then on later albums again, very same vein. For me, this is my favorite song on the album. I love it. I love that kind of delayed introduction, almost like that big build up before you actually get into the song, and then that pause and the breakdown in the middle, and then the build up and the start again. I love it. It's my favorite song for sure.
Well, one of the tracks that I'm conflicted on is track 8, Corrosion, because to me, it's a cool song. It just sounds overloaded with so much stuff going on that, they talk about how as a kid, you should listen to music that your parents don't like, because then that's like defines your generation. I don't know, kids from the 1950s were listening to rock and roll and their parents were listening to Frank Sinatra. Kids from the, 80s were listening to whatever, metal, Metallica, Megadeth, those sorts of bands, and I'm sure their parents weren't happy. I think if you were to put this, if you were a 15-year-old and you put the Corrosion on, I think it would pretty much make your parents' head explode in 1992.
Yeah.
It's just such it's just such an assault on your ears. There's like sounds of like sirens and samples going on, and the big riffs and the drums, and it's just like this would be the song where I'd be like, "Son, are you on drugs? Like, what's going on?"
And it reminds me of at the time I was in a band with a friend who loved this band, and he would like write his own industrial songs, and they would sound like this. You know what I mean? Because it would just be like he'd find a cool drum loop or create a cool drum machine beat, and then he would just put a bunch of crap on top of it, and just experiment and do crazy stuff, and it would pretty much sound like this, and so not only was he listening to music that I'm sure made his parents concerned, he was making music that would make his parents concerned.
I agree with you, Tim. It's almost a bit overwhelming. So, if you're listening to it late at night, this album, and it's dark and it's just a bit too much. So it could either do with being a little bit shorter or being a little bit less brooding, I think.
I think if you pair that song with the last song, Grace, you've made when they torture people in Gitmo and they just like blare music at them to get them to break down over time. I think if you just played these last two songs over and over again, I think you could probably break someone in about 15 minutes.
Well, were they one of the bands that were used for that? Because I know one of the bands is suing the government. Who was it? Oh, shit.
Well, there's a Canadian band that's suing them.
Yeah, who was it?
Is it Killing Joke? Are they the band? Or Skinny Puppy?
Skinny Puppy, I think.
Yeah,
I think it's Skinny Puppy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So I would not doubt at all that Ministry was not used for the same effect. They may have very well used these songs.
See, I would be an excellent DJ for torture because I was like, these would make good torture songs. But this sort of matches what we've experienced in about half the records we reviewed in the 90s, which is you have the sort of experimental closing song. This is one where it just sort of sounds like it actually sounds like there's a battle going on between several radio stations at times.
Yeah, it's barely constitutes a song, other than some I think there's some crash cymbals in there, like.
I think it's a showcase of what you can program.
Yeah. So let's take a listen, or let's not take a listen. Let's take a look at the album as a whole. Do you think it stands up? Let me ask that first. Do you think this album, both in terms of songwriting and then sonically, do you think that this album stands up?
It does. I think there's at least half the record here where I think because it influenced so much music, so much heavy music since then, that it sounds very to date, minus a couple lyrical things here and there, but I just think it was so influential that it actually has carried the record forward. That influence has carried the record forward to be, still sounds pretty good now. So, for sure.
How about you, Matt?
I certainly think the really good songs on it definitely stand the test of time. I think if you were going to modernize them, you'd just get someone to either do some DJ scratching or some kind of electro behind it. And I think you'd immediately contemporize a lot of those songs, because I think Jay's right. I think a lot of what they were doing then is still being used today, or people have learned from that and taken it forwards. I think Corrosion and Grace are probably they're songs of their time, and they're songs to showcase what people can do with programming and the kind of loops and sampling. And I don't think they'd particularly stand up today. They'd be album kind of filler at best today. And I don't think TV2 really goes anywhere, probably.
So on our patented rating scale of a worthy album, a better EP, or a decent single, we have to sort of shrink the EP list number down, because since it's a short record at 9 already, I'd say if you're at 5 or more, because of the length of these songs, some of them, you're probably at it. I would guess that would be a worthy album. If you're at less than 5, it'd be an EP. So, Jay, where are you at?
I'm at 5. N.W.O, Just One Fix, Hero, Jesus Built My Hot Rod, Psalm 69. So I guess that on your scale constitutes an album. I struggle a little bit with, obviously the classic feedback we have on most of these records that we review is most of the songs could be shorter. I think the thing I struggle with on this is that the repetition is part of the aesthetic. It's part of the music. I still feel like some of them you could trim a minute off, especially some of them that are faster. It's kind of amazing to me that the tempos are pretty quick on several of these, and they still are pushing 5 minutes or more.
Yeah.
Usually find when you up the tempo, the songs naturally just get shorter. So, I'm at 5, and I guess if they were trimmed up a little bit, I would like it even more, but I can take it as it is.
That's the same list I had, actually. So we're right on the same scale. How about you, Matt? So this is a band that you have every album. When you're going back and listening to this, are you playing every song, or are there songs you're ditching?
I probably skip one or two of them. So it's definitely a worthy album for me. If I'm driving in the car, I probably just don't need Corrosion into Grace. I'd skip one of those probably. I'm not a huge fan of Scarecrow.
If you're driving in the car, I hope you're in a good mood when you're listening to this, because otherwise there'll be some road rage incidents.
Dude, I was listening to it on my commute this week, and the other, I think it was actually last night coming home. I'm sorry, Friday night coming home. Something happened with the Bluetooth controller, whatever, and Corrosion was on, and it wouldn't let me fast forward. Like usually I can fast forward, for some reason the buttons weren't working. And I'm sitting there in traffic, and like I had my windows open and the sunroof open, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, I got to get past this song. Like it's not only is it annoying me, it's probably annoying everyone around me. When I couldn't get it to fast forward, and I couldn't pick my phone up because I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. So I was like in a moment of like, I almost felt like I was being tortured. It's like, I got to get to another song. Stop. I almost switched to just regular radio for a minute.
Whoa, you don't want to do that.
No, I stopped myself. I didn't do that. I'm saying consider it.
All right. Well, that is our review and revisitation of Psalm 69, The Way to Succeed and The Way to Suck Eggs, or whatever that other weird title is that I can't pronounce. Thanks, Matt, for joining us. Thanks for getting on the Skype and figuring out the time difference thing. Made it a bit easier for us to all get on board together. So, and thanks for your continued support of the podcast. We really appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, if you want to suggest an album for us to review, head on over to digmeoutpodcast.com and tell us what you think we should be checking out. And if you liked what you heard, head on over to iTunes for opportunity to leave us some feedback on the podcast. And of course, you can always check us out at Facebook and Twitter and all those other places where you can chime in on our albums that we review and chime in on the albums that are coming up. So that's it for Jay and Matt over in the UK. I'm Tim. We're signing off, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our Request a Review and merchandise pages.